Yes, so I lead something called the COMET Initiative, and when COMET was set up in 2010, we thought the acronym was fantastic. It stood for Core Outcome Measures in Effectiveness Trials, and by effectiveness trials, I'm talking about late phase trials, comparative effectiveness trials, the sort of trials that the NHS really wants to know the answers to. Actually, these days we sort of think about the ET as being evaluating treatment because, of course, there are other treatment or therapy, there are other form designs that are important as well. Core outcome sets actually are being developed both for research and for routine care, and I might have time to say something a little bit more about that later. So I wanted to cover three areas today. I thought I do know from the questions that were asked that were showing insight that many of you do know about core outcome sets already, but also some people did want an introduction, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time giving you a lowdown on what they are and why they matter. Then there's a section on how are they developed, because I am aware that some core outcome sets have been funded through RFPB, several through NIHR fellowships, and although you may not see very many, you know, the NIHR is a excuse me, a great supporter of funding the development of core outcome sets. So it's a brief overview of how they're typically developed. And then finally, something that you may see more of, which is, well, hopefully, either trialists or researchers asking you, should I be using a core outcome set, in which case you might want to know how to advise on that, or indeed you might say to the researcher, have you thought about including a core outcome set in your study? So on to the first one. So if any of you have either been involved in a Cochrane systematic review or seen somebody's systematic review, this sort of summary of the outcomes measured in different studies won't be a surprise. So you'll see from the x-axis that although there were nearly 200 studies in this systematic review, the most frequently measured outcome, which was symmetry, this is a systematic review of cosmesis, breast reconstruction cosmesis. You'll see that even symmetry was only measured in a bit less than half. And this also displays that it's not just what was being measured in those studies, it's also how. So symmetry can be measured in different ways. It can be a clinical assessment, a patient-reported assessment, a photograph, or geometric measurements. So I won't labour the point, but essentially outcomes are a bit of a mess when you look across studies of a similar question. So what are the problems? I've mentioned these inconsistencies, variabilities in what's being measured and how, and also the fact that we know there is empirical evidence that about a third of clinical trials don't report all the outcomes that they measured, and actually they selectively report those that tend to fit the story that they want to tell. So this is a problem of outcome reporting bias, selecting what to report on the basis of the results. It means the literature is biased, and that's the literature that you see, let alone the literature that you don't see. Studies, this is a really important point actually, that studies often lack outcomes that are most important to patients and others who make decisions about healthcare, such as NICE. And this obviously means it's really difficult for decision makers when they're looking across studies because they don't always see the data on the outcomes that really matter for those decisions, and that's not in anybody's best interests. To come back to the point about what patients think is important. So in Canada, there's an equivalent sort of NICE, a group, organisation developing clinical guidelines, and they reviewed 30 of their clinical guidelines. They have patients on their clinical guidelines panel, and they asked patients for each of those 30 guidelines what outcomes mattered to them. And of the outcomes that those patients said, only half of them had been captured in any of the studies in any of those clinical guidelines. So you can see that there is a mismatch here. So a core outcome set is potentially a way of overcoming that. problem, and a core outcome set has been defined as, if it's a core outcome set for trials, then it's an agreed standardized set of outcomes that should be measured and reported as a minimum in all clinical trials in specific areas of health or healthcare. It's not a single core outcome set for everything. It is specific. I'll come back to that scope in a minute, but the as a minimum is underlined because it's important. We're not trying to stop people measuring things that they believe are important. We're just trying to get some form of standardization on some key critical outcomes so that some form of comparison calibration can be undertaken. To give you an example of a core outcome set, this is the what stage. This was for core outcome set for studies in acute respiratory failure survivors. It's highly relevant. It has helped to inform the current core outcome set for long COVID that we're working on. But essentially, you can see the sorts of outcomes there, the what, okay. You will also notice that some of them are rather large buckets. They're more outcome domains than specific outcomes. There is then the how stage, and this is the result of that work. So in a sense, survival requires a definition rather than an instrument. Health-related quality of life, the recommendation was EQ5D, but there was an optional recommendation about using SF36. There are some recommendations for some of these domains that aren't always a recommendation. So whilst it's really important that it was identified that cognition was really key in this core outcome set, when they reviewed the literature on outcomes measurement instruments for cognition in acute respiratory failure, it demonstrated that the measurement properties were sufficient. They have made sort of interim recommendations, but they've also made research recommendations that they need more research to demonstrate the validity and reliability of some of these outcome measures. So, it isn't an answer to everything. I wouldn't want anyone to think they could go to the COMET database and find the answer. You will find some answers and some things that still remain as a research recommendation. So I mentioned the COMET database. So the COMET has a website. If you look at the top left there, you've got to search the COMET database. You can put in, whatever you like. You can put in asthma, hypertension, and it will search the COMET database. We strongly recommend for RDS advisors that you use the advanced search. We're working on it, but for example, if you type in haemophilia and you use an English spelling, you'll get it. If you put the American spelling without the A, you won't. So we're working on that. It's quite complicated, but if you go to the advanced search, you can search by health condition and you'll see what you want there. How have we populated that database? Well, we started with an original systematic review in 2013, and we've updated it annually. This is slightly out of date now because as of the end of 2019, there were 370 studies within which there was some more than one cause, but there was 450 core outcome sets published. We've just found 55 in our update in 2020, and indeed there are lots that are ongoing, and you'll see why there are so many when I talk about the scope. But essentially, we ask people to register their core outcome sets in the database. So that is a really good advice that you could give to people, partly because we want them to, we want others to know whether there's something that's already ongoing and that they can maybe get together rather than duplicate. This is the kind of, as of 2019, apologies, it hasn't quite been updated, but you can see that the vast majority of core outcome sets are in cancer. Rheumatology has a very large number, and that's because I have an amazing group, the OMERACT group, that have been working together for 25 years. And you can see in the middle there, mental health. Considering the burden of mental health, there's hardly any core outcome sets that have been developed, but there are some that are ongoing. An overview, core outcome sets for trials, people have been working on them, developing them since 2010, but now people are really starting to realise that they are relevant elsewhere in the system. So if you start at the top right, our core outcome sets are being recommended by funders, by regulators such as the EMA. There's also a recommendation in the Cochrane Handbook that systematic reviewers should choose their outcomes by having considered core outcome sets. NICE have changed their HTA if you're looking at the NICE HTA consultation, at the moment they have a recommendation the same, similarly for NICE clinical guidelines and other groups around the world. So it's really starting to take hold. Core outcome sets, I've put them at the center of this diagram because essentially people are starting to talk about the life cycle for research, and we're trying to look at whether core outcome sets, which are the really important outcomes that should really flow right through this system. Okay, if you wanted to find out who around the world is endorsing core outcome set, you can go on the website. There's an endorsement page. You can see trial funders, NIHR, PCORI in the States, Horizon 2020, KCE in Belgium. We're just trying to add to those that sort of list, but you could go and have a look if you were interested in. So, well, do they work? Okay, so this is the core outcome set for rheumatoid arthritis. The graph shows on the x-axis the year. It was published in 1985, and you can see on the x-axis, sorry, the y-axis, that this is the percentage of trials in rheumatoid arthritis that did measure and report the core outcome set, which is listed on the left, 7 outcomes with an extra one if you're following up over a year. And you can see that over the course of time, it has reached a kind of steady state of about 80%. Those 3 vertical lines are really when, the publication was in 1995. That's when the first vertical line is drawn. And then there were subsequent endorsements, recommendations by the FDA and the EMA. This is observational data, but it's probably no surprise that after those regulators recommended it, that the uptake started to increase. Now, this is a highly selected example, okay, of one that has the best uptake in trials. Many others have not had such traction, and I'll come back to that shortly. But essentially, the NIHR do endorse the use of core outcome sets. If you look at the guidance to applicants, you would find the text in italic that it does say you should include them unless there's good reason to do otherwise. So it's not mandatory. And the reason it's not mandatory is because not all core outcome sets are developed to the same standards. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay. Now, we looked at this recommendation went into the guidance in 2012, and the PhD student Karen Hughes, this work is published, looked at the first sort of 4 years of HTA funded applications, applications, and found that 38% did state that they searched for a cause. Of those that searched, 36% found one and used one. But actually, we found that a fifth more could have used a potentially relevant cause. So people who didn't search for it were actually missing. And they weren't following the NIHR guidance, but many people don't. But there was a possibility that they could have used a core outcome set. Karen is currently updating this work on the 2016 to 2019 applications. We really hope there's been an increase, as do the NIHR, but I don't have those data at the moment. This is an example where the EMA are recommending the cause, and this is for pediatric asthma. And in terms of systematic reviewers, we recently published, or last year published, we looked at the first Cochrane reviews, 100 Cochrane reviews published in 2019, just before the recommendation came out in the handbook. So this is kind of like a baseline, and we'll do an update later. No surprise, 40% of reviewers noted the problems about inconsistency. There was far more than that, but at 40% actually said something about it. 7% did reference a core outcome set in terms of them choosing their outcomes, but a potentially relevant core outcome set exists for a further 35%. So lots of potential for core outcome sets to be used in systematic reviews. If you want to know more about the state of play in terms of cost uptake, we held a webinar as part of this COMET 2020 webinar series. The recordings are on the COMET website. So I know that these slides will be available through the recording, but the slides can also be available because there are different resource references in here. This is not going to be a session whereby by the end of it, you'll be able to go and develop a core outcome set. I'm just pulling out, oh, some of you probably will actually based on your experience, but I'm just going to pull out some of the key features. Oh, hang on, Okay, so the very first thing people should be doing is actually asking the question, do we need a core outcome set for the question that they're interested in? Carol Hughes, PhD student, has also interviewed trialists, some of who used a core outcome set, some of whom didn't. This quote from those interviews is really poignant. So somebody said, what needs to happen is probably there needs to be as much attention paid to the topic itself before anything is done. The topic being, is a core outcome set needed? Whether it's appropriate to have a core outcome set for that particular thing they're trying to do it for. So we have noticed, I mean, you know, there's great enthusiasm for the development of core outcome sets. People do tend to start them rather quickly. And what happens is they find at the end that maybe there's not so much endorsement for the need or use as they might have hoped. So we strongly recommend that actually, first of all, you need to review existing core outcome sets. You should search the COMET database. There might be something that's not exactly what you want to develop, but something that's relevant, you know, close to it. You really need to think whether we need another core outcome set. But also being clear about the rationale if there is one that exists. So perhaps there's one exists and it didn't involve patients. That would be a good rationale for trying to update it or amend it to include the patient voice. So we strongly recommend that people actually sort of hold a workshop, a working group with relevant stakeholders to see whether there is agreement that a core outcome set is needed in an area. There are several resources available for developing a core outcome set on the COMET website. They're all published. We have recommendations these are all from international consensus exercises, 11 recommendations about how to develop, what you should do when you're developing a core outcome set, what should be in a protocol, and how they should be reported. There's lots more information in the COMET handbook, and then there's also a guideline about, once you know what you want to measure in a core outcome set, how you decide how to measure things. I mentioned the scope of a core outcome set. So this is one of the hardest parts, I think. It's a bit like writing down your PIC bit of the PICO framework, okay? I'll come back to the setting in a minute, but certainly you need to specify the health condition and the population. So is it asthma in adults? Is it asthma in children? Is it asthma in all patients? And you also need to specify the types of intervention. Is it any and all treatment of colorectal cancer, or is it just a core outcome set for surgical studies in colorectal cancer? But as well as that, I mentioned earlier on that core outcome sets really started to be developed for trials, for research settings, but increasingly people are starting to develop a set that will be routinely recorded in routine care. They may be referred to as minimum data sets. They may be parts of registries, but increasingly we are seeing core outcome sets being developed for routine care. I've just gone through some of these. Okay, I've managed to talk all the way through these already. Right, so standards 5 to 7 relate to whose opinion should be taken into account when you're deciding what the core outcome set should be. And in the consensus work that we did, there was agreement that there are 3 stakeholder groups that are really important to include. And that's healthcare professionals who would be caring for people with the health condition, patients and patient representatives, so people with lived experience of the condition, and also those who will do the research that will use the core outcome set, that should use the core outcome set. So the clinical trialists, and that includes industry trialists, you know, we need to, there's no point in developing a core outcome set if the people you want to use it are not going to use it. So sort of implementation science tells us that you're more likely to achieve implementation if you've actually involved the relevant stakeholders at the beginning. Now, there was a fourth group in that consensus exercise that didn't quite meet the consensus standard, and that was a bit difficult to get head around, but those who will use the research that should have used the core outcome set. So systematic reviewers who review trials, guideline developers, policymakers, regulators. It didn't make it, the standards were developed about 4 years ago, and it didn't make it in, it nearly did, but it didn't quite make it in because standards, they're minimum standards, and minimum standards are those that need to be met. And some people have struggled to engage regulators, policymakers, and guideline developers in their work. So we didn't want to set a standard that just couldn't always be achieved. I think if we ran this standards exercise again now, that group would probably go in. There has been much more interest in those organisations really getting involved in participating in what the outcomes that are important should be and how they're determined. The stage of a core outcome set development may well vary by the group, and in particular, whether it's patients or patient representatives, it will vary by their health condition. So a key question to ask is, who are the relevant stakeholders for a particular core outcome set, both perspectives and geography. It's important actually to ask, well, is there evidence that already exists for their views? In the COMET database, when we do our systematic review updates, we come across information and publications not just about core outcome sets, but actually about other work that will be relevant to people who might want to develop a core outcome set. So we come across data, publications around people's lived experience with a health condition, and that will often contain some information on what outcomes matter to them. It may not be the primary aim of that qualitative study, but we put it into the database and classify it as a patient views study. So the COMET database has actually got more in it than just the core outcome sets. In terms of this point about who should be involved, Karen's interviews gave a really nice quote that there's a thing that a lot of, and for anonymisation we've written clinicians in this specialty, they feel that this is developed by people who aren't involved in our world, and I think there's a thing about engagement here that's a real problem. So there's something about the team developing a core outcome set really need to understand the clinical world and involve people who are treating patients with the health condition, and so it's not enough to have a single clinician leading a core outcome set. They need a team around them, they need a steering group around them who can help them identify wider groups of stakeholders. Patients, I've already shown that patients can have different views about what matters to them to the research that has been done to date. This shows the state of play with up to 2019 with core outcome sets in terms of whether the patient voice is included, whether patients are participants in core outcome set development. And you can see over the course of time, the percentage of core outcome sets that have been developed that include patients has been going up, and it's over 90% for those that are ongoing. So it's no longer whether to include patients, but rather how. So COMET has a group called POPPY, and POPPY develops all sorts of resources to try to promote but also facilitate patient participation. And actually there's also work now going on to facilitate PPI in core outcome set development, because it's as equally important for a core outcome set study to have patients helping to advise on how to do that work as it is in a clinical trial. This shows the impact of having patients involved in core outcome sets. It's quite a busy slide, but what I wanted to show you was pick out, this is what we looked, this is a few years old now, but we looked at the core outcome sets that did and didn't involve patients. And it's out of date because so many more core outcome sets do involve patients now. But if you look at the columns with the numbers in on the left-hand side, and you can see that life impact in that domain, I mean, there are lots of different outcomes in there, but we classified all the core outcome sets, core outcomes, according to which domain they were in. If you look at life impact, you will see that the core outcome sets that didn't involve patients, 63% of them included some outcome that would fit in a life impact domain, whereas that percentage went up to 86 when you ask patients. So those of you that have worked with patients before will recognise that as being something you'd anticipate, that patients really care about the impact of things on their life and not just physiological measurements, which often don't mean anything to them. Okay, if you want to know more about how patients are being included and different ways to involve patients in core outcome set development, again, there's another webinar and that's recorded and it's on the COMET database. So the meat here now is I don't want to put too much emphasis on the consensus process as being the most important thing. Actually, the stakeholders are probably the most important thing, because these are the people who are going to determine what is core. But coming on to the consensus process, you've now defined the scope of the core outcome set, what the sort of studies that it is going to be relevant to. You've defined the stakeholders that you want to involve, and now this moves on to a consensus process about how do we agree what the core outcomes should be. So this is a sort of these are the standards that we start by constructing a list that has considered both healthcare professionals and patients' views, that care is taken around language. There mustn't be any ambiguity in how those outcomes are described, that there is a scoring process and a consensus definition a priori. That's important so that people don't look at the results and then decide what meets consensus afterwards. That could be unduly biased by people's views about what they think should be in. And then also that criteria, again, for the same reason, about whether you're going to add or drop things as you go through a consensus process, that should be declared a priori. And these are the reasons that we like protocols to be written for a core outcome set study, just as they are with any other research study, so that these a priori decisions can be listed in the protocol. This is a typical core outcome set development process. It's not the only way that things are done, but generally speaking, most people follow this sort of methodology. So you'll see that the first stage is about trying to find that long list of candidate outcomes. And generally speaking, there are two parts to this. One is looking at what's been published already, and that might be published, but it might also be registries. Trial registries, for example, are really good because they include ongoing studies, and that gives you a more up-to-date overview of outcomes that are being measured in those studies, rather than looking at published literature, which tells you about the outcomes people chose 3, 4, 5 years ago. But at the right-hand side, you'll see it's also important to look for literature about outcomes that were important to patients. If there aren't any such studies or insufficient studies, people have also looked at patient-reported outcome development studies, because they don't always actually involve patients. That was a bit of a shock to me, but mostly they do. So there'll be some patient views in those studies. But if there isn't sufficient, then core outcome set developers do actually undertake new primary research with patients. So it may be an interview study or focus groups. After you've done that work, you put those outcomes together, you make sure that the wording is clear. Often an outcome will have been measured in studies, but described in different ways. So there's a process of sort of consolidation to get to this list. And once you have that list, then you go into some sort of consensus process, an example of which is a Delphi study. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that because that's the most common method that's used these days. At the end of the Delphi study, you then hold a consensus meeting, and that's really to sort of ratify the results of your previous work, but also to discuss face-to-face and, well, or online, but seeing people at least. You can discuss any areas where there wasn't consensus about whether something should be core or not. After you've done all that, what comes out of that is you know what you want to measure. So it might be it might be pain, it might be some aspect of physical functioning, daily activities of daily living, for example, but then you need to go on to a stage where you're determining how to measure each of those outcomes that are core. So you have a list, and ideally you'd have patient research partners in your study team, and you should make sure that the list and the help text explanation around outcomes is really clear to patients. This was the methods and how they broke down up to 2019. If you look at the penultimate row, mixed methods. So that mixed methods, that was the majority, and it did tend to include things like a systematic review followed by a Delphi study. If we actually, I don't think, I haven't got the results, but the Delphi survey, I think over 80% of core outcome sets in 2020, and also of those that are ongoing, include a Delphi survey. But not all groups have used a Delphi survey. So if I just go back to here, you can see that some people had a kind of discussion group only. So they had an expert group, and several years ago they would have been sat around a table. Those sorts of core outcome sets don't tend to involve patients sitting around that same table, but that certainly there have been core outcome sets recommended by that kind of round table discussion. That's becoming less common now, and people are moving on to Delphis. Does it matter? Does it matter what your process of trying to reach consensus is? So here is the example from pediatric asthma. There were 3 core outcome sets that were all developed around the same time, and that's largely because the EMA made a call for kind of more work to be done on what the outcomes that were important to children with asthma should be. And I was involved in the Sinner et al. Work, and that was based in the UK, and the other 2, Redell and Buser, were based in the US. And you can see there is some overlap, that symptoms and exacerbations are common, but you'll also see some differences. So if you look to the second half of the table, the first column where it says lung function, you'll see that the US studies, Redell and Buser, had that lung function is an essential outcome. That wasn't essential in our study in the UK. So what's the difference? In our study, we involved parents and some children. They didn't in the other studies. Okay, and lung function, whilst it's measured, doesn't necessarily mean anything to patients. What was more important to patients were things like quality of life and symptoms and normal activities. You'll also see that death was a core outcome for people in the UK, but not in the US. Now, that's not to say that the US said it wasn't important, not at all. And it would typically always be measured in studies we know. But what this raised at the consensus meeting was an awareness now that for parents, that's often the first thing they think about when their child is diagnosed with asthma. And the health professionals involved didn't realise that that was, really concerning parents. So the health professionals were learning from this exercise that they needed to reassure patients. Death is fortunately very, very rare in children with asthma in the UK. Not so much in lower and middle income countries, but the kind of consensus process whereby you bring different stakeholder groups together can actually be informative around areas of disagreement or misunderstanding as much as it is for developing a core outcome set. So what happens in a Delphi? Essentially, you have one or more panels of experts. You are sent questionnaires or online surveys. You score the items within it. You then wait for a bit, and then you're sent some feedback, some results from that first round, and you're asked to reconsider based on the feedback, and you can score them. And most Delphis are now online, although there are still some sent out by post. But what it enables you, particularly if it's online, is you can involve a really large panel of people or panels of people, so lots of people giving their views. This is the slide that I was looking for before. So this shows you that over 90% of the studies that are ongoing are planning or are indeed using a Delphi survey as part of their consensus process. So I'm not going through all of these. There are several issues to consider in a Delphi survey. Okay, I'm going to highlight some of the key ones that we're often asked about and the sort of typical response. So the first one was, well, how many people should be involved? Okay, what's the ideal group size? The decision isn't based on anything such as a power calculation. The choice is often pragmatic, but you really need to take into account the health condition, the intervention, how common it is, and also whether you want global representativeness. I mentioned in the pediatric asthma study that the one that I was involved in was with UK stakeholders. There was other ones in the US. I think these days there is increasing awareness that for core outcome sets really to have impact, they need to be relevant everywhere. The how things are measured may well differ in higher or lower resource settings, but generally speaking, there's an increase in trying to engage people internationally in core outcome set development. The important point, though, is that for people with lived experience, for those participants, they really need to try to be representative of the population that the core outcome set should apply to. And my mantra is the more the better, okay? But the representativeness is really the thing that's key. Number of rounds. So typically, so people use different terminology around Delphi. Some people would say that an initial elicitation from people of what's important to sort of start to form a list is round one. We don't use that terminology. We say the Delphi starts when you have the list. And so the first scoring of a list is round one. Then you give feedback and it becomes round two. And you may go on and give further feedback and there's a third round. It's typically only 2 or 3. You see attrition after 3 rounds. And so we tend to focus on 2, and we get participation rates of around 85% in round 2. So we're keeping the vast majority of people involved. Obviously, it will depend on time, costs, and participant burden, depending on how many outcomes you have on your list. Scoring, again, occasional variation, but generally speaking, we follow the approach that GRADE uses for looking at evidence. It's a 9-point scale. It's kind of chunked into 3-point subscales. And the typical wording that people use, you can see if you score it 7 to 9, what you mean there is that the outcome is, it's critical that it's included in the core outcome set. We had a PhD student, Rebecca Fish, was trying to decide what form of feedback to show in round 2, and she did a small study with 8 patients. And interestingly, almost nobody understood average to be the mean. Nobody understood what the median was. There was only 2 of 8 of those patients who could say, you know, what either a mean was or a median. On the other hand, when they were looking at distribution of scores across the 1 to 9 scale, either in a pie chart or in a bar chart, not a histogram, but a bar chart, they understood what they were seeing there, okay? And they all thought it was really helpful to see that distribution. And that's largely because some core outcome set developers have in the past shown the mean score for an outcome, and that's it, or the median score. They haven't shown the distribution, and patients have fed back that they felt when they scored something as a 5 and the mean was a 7, they felt really bad and didn't really want to participate because they felt completely different from the average, if you like, patient in the study. When they see the distribution, undoubtedly there'll be some other people who also scored a 5, and they liked to see that when they saw those distributions. They liked to see the fact that they weren't the only ones scoring that way, but they also appreciated seeing what the vast majority of people were also saying. So there's also evidence now from nested randomized studies that actually when you do the feedback, we know that patients and healthcare professionals as 2 stakeholder groups are not always going to agree about what outcomes are core. So we know that what we're trying to do is get to a consensus between them about what they do agree on. And you can show that if you present feedback for those two groups separately, but everybody does see those results for the two groups, that it actually increases the resulting consensus. So in an online system, it would sort of look like this. You wouldn't necessarily have those 4 graphs, but each graph is showing the distribution of scores for different stakeholder groups. So this isn't a core outcome set project. It's actually a different Delphi study, but you could imagine that you can see eyeball the kind of where the bulk of the opinion is over to the 7 to 9 for different groups, and that study has shown that this does tend to improve. We have data on people giving their reasons about why they changed their score from round 1 to 2, and it's often that health professionals see the patient's views and say, I didn't realise this was so important to them, and they shift their score towards the patients. We do have patients saying, I didn't realise it was so important to health professionals. I really, respect their view. But it does tend to be most often health professionals shifting towards patient views, which is good to see. Consensus definitions, these vary, okay, and it is challenging to come up with any sort of sensible rationale for anything. But you see examples such as if you present the results for the different stakeholders, that an item or an outcome would be deemed to be in if, say, the vast majority, 70% or more, of both the patient group and the health professionals have scored it as critical. But some people do add in, or if it doesn't, both groups don't have to necessarily agree that it's core, but if one group is so absolutely convinced, so more than 90% say it's critical, then that could be in. So there's lots of opportunities for different definitions, and that's why we strongly recommend that it's defined a priori in the protocol. Once the Delphi has been done, a typical approach is, as I said, is then to bring the results to a meeting. There are lots of questions about how to run that meeting. This is an example approach. Essentially, you send stuff out in advance. You have at the start of the meeting or prior to the meeting, you have a meeting with patients who'll be at that meeting to sort of empower them to give their views in the meeting. You start at the meeting with a reminder of what this is all about, because it may be a few weeks since they last scored the Delphi to when they can actually come to the meeting. And generally speaking, you look at the outcomes that are in from the Delphi, and you don't really want to overturn a Delphi, not if it's been done well and it has involved far more people than you have at your meeting. So we tend to work on the basis that things that are in from the Delphi, you only ask if there's any fatal flaw with them that they should go out. Things where the minority of stakeholders said something should be in, that would be out. And you only ask people if they have a major reason to put something in. And the focus of the meeting is on that bottom group where there's really no consensus. One of the stakeholders, the majority, more than 50% says it should be in. And that's where you start the discussion. I mentioned there were standards, 11 of them. There's a column in there in the middle, standard met. You can see that the standards around the scope have all been met. This is for results, core outcome sets in 2019. But as you work down the standards, the reporting of what they've done isn't great. There's not enough detail about how they've run the consensus process. So we're hoping then when we get these results for 2020 that things are looking better than that. So I'm conscious that I did say I'd stop at 10 to 11, and I think this is quite a good time to break. What I've done so far is talk about methods to reach decisions about what outcomes are core. The next phase is about the how. I'm not going to spend too much time about it, but I think it's probably quite a good time to break. Okay, so where we got to was that let's assume the core outcome set in terms of what to measure has been agreed. The typical number of outcomes is actually around 6 or 7, but several core outcome sets may go as many as 14 and some even higher. Once you know what is core, it is really important to think about how those core outcomes should be measured. So in Karen's interviews with trialists who were looking at using a core outcome set, they said things like, it's all well and good having, say, health-related quality of life in all studies, but if everyone measures it a different way, then you might be left with the same problem of not necessarily being able to combine data from different quality of life tools. And another trialist said, well, I looked more at the overall domains and the fact, so that's the what, and the fact that they couldn't tell me all the measures, the how, I just thought, right, this is not really helping me very much. When are you going to do some more? And it is certainly true that many core outcome set development teams do the what. So these are the results from 2019, and you can see that only a third of them also develop the how. So we really need to encourage core outcome set development teams that it's not just about the what. The what is helpful, of course it is, you know, and if all you can do is the what, it's still going to help. But to really get uptake and impact, the how stage needs to be completed. And we are hoping that Karen's interviews, which make it clear that actually people really need the how, will help the funders to see that this is just as important. Otherwise, a lot of this work could actually contribute to research waste. Lots of core outcome sets being developed that are never used. The aim is to help them reduce research waste if they're used, but if they're not used because nobody completes the how stage, then it's a problem. There, as I said, there's a guideline. It was developed by Cosmin in collaboration with COMET about, you know, kind of like the approach to how you would go about choosing either an outcome measurement instrument or an outcome definition. I'm not going to go into that. It is complicated, okay, and it does need people with sort of more. If you're talking about outcome measurement instruments, questionnaires, quality of life, you need people with psychometric experience, kind of looking at those people who. I mentioned there was a move towards trying to get more international participation in core outcome sets, and we are encouraging core outcome set developers to think big. Again, results up to 2019 for published core outcome sets. This is the participation by continent. So you can see the vast majority of core outcome sets have involved people from Europe or North America, with far less participation from people from Africa and South America. Asia is heavily dominated by China, and they are increasingly active in the area of core outcome sets. The Chinese Cochrane Center has set up a Chinese core outcome set center, which is linked to COMET. So we're really trying to improve that, but it does have challenges, of course. So if you want to know more about international core outcome set development, there's a PhD student based in Kenya, Jamlik, and also Bilal Al-Kahaf, who's based at Manchester in Manchester, and they've given some nice webinars about their experience of core outcome set development in multiple countries. Okay, so I am on to the final session, so I think I'll just press on with this. We may end up having a lot longer than 20 minutes, actually. But that's absolutely fine. So the final bit is actually where I'm thinking you may get asked more often, and that is, I don't know, I've heard about this thing called a core outcome set. I think I'm supposed to consider it. How do I find it? And how do I consider whether it's relevant? So choosing a core outcome set for your clinical trial or for your research study more generally. Well, let's first of all have a look at what we know about how trialists already decide their outcomes. So I mentioned we'd reviewed NIHR applications, 2012 to 2015. Karen also did a survey of applicants and asked them, well, if you didn't use a core outcome set, how did you decide which outcomes to include in your trials? Multiple answers were possible, and you can see, I mean, it's great that over half have said they asked patients and the public, but you have to wonder why it's not higher. So But it's great that at least half did. And you can see that there is an element of, well, I've seen this used in other trials, so I'm going to use it in my trial. And that is important, that kind of, you know, even if it's a legacy outcome, you do need to sort of get some element of compare and contrast. So that's understandable. You can see that the funding board does have some influence, so that's great. We have seen the NIHR panels sending back advice about considering core outcome sets, or indeed considering some other outcomes. So they're using a variety of different methods. Now, in terms of deciding whether to use a core outcome set, obviously we would say this, but it is the only place where core outcome sets are brought together, and that is in the COMET database. We feel that our search strategy is comprehensive. We actually populate it as we go along. I said we were doing a review every year, but actually we're being told about core outcome sets as they're published. People are registering them, people are letting us know that they're published. We also have citation alerts on the COMET resources, so we pick them up as we're going along. And actually for the 2020 update, we actually knew about 85% of those 55 already. So I wouldn't want you to think that the COMET database is always a year out of date. It isn't. We might miss one or two, you know, but generally it is pretty comprehensive. So there are two elements to think about. One is the applicability. You know, what is the scope of the core outcome set you've found, and what's the scope of the study you want to do? And then how is the core outcome set being developed? You've seen that there are 11 standards. You've seen that there's a variety of different ways that people can develop them. It is not the case that you should treat all of the core outcome sets in the COMET database equally. We actually don't put the core outcomes into we know what the core outcomes are, but we don't put them into the database to be available publicly. We give the publication reference for researchers and advisors to go and look at it themselves, and that's because, I mean, there isn't any formal kite mark for a core outcome set. Quality is hard to define, you know, and what's good enough for one setting may not be good enough for another. So we really have taken the position of saying we want people to read the actual core outcome set publication and critique it and decide for themselves whether the development was good enough. So I've shown that already. So, you know, you may be lucky and you might find something that's in the health condition area and you're having a look at whether it's applicable. Sort of questions to ask. Well, has it been developed? You saw that the scope for a core outcome set, it could be adults, it could be children, it could be both. It could be people with advanced prostate cancer, it could be people with localized prostate cancer. So basically is what you're wanting to do in the same or a different patient group as the core outcome set. If it's a different patient group, you don't necessarily need to completely rule it out as being considered, that you should consider it. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But is it the same or is it a different intervention type? You know, there'll be some core outcome sets that are relevant for all interventions. So it doesn't matter what your trial is, you should consider that core outcome set. But you might be doing a core outcome set of, say, medical treatment versus watchful waiting, and actually there's a core outcome set for surgery. Should you be considering it? My own view is if there's something in the health condition, look at it. It doesn't do any harm. You do not have to use it if you think there's a reason why it's not applicable, but it's you know, it's evidence that if it's been well done, that should be considered. Okay, now if you find that there isn't a directly relevant core outcome set, you know, exactly matching your PIC of the PICO framework, but that there is something in related area, we would recommend that you then take that core outcome set and you ask a few people, maybe on your steering group, you might have patient research partners, you'll have health professionals, ask them whether they think what you're seeing, not directly relevant, but it might be generalizable. So here's an example. The NIHR-HTA wanted to commission a trial of grommets versus hearing aids in children with otitis media with effusion. Sorry, roll back. Suppose you are applying to the HTA for a trial of grommets versus hearing aids in children who have otitis media with effusion. Okay, so there actually is a core outcome set for the treatment of otitis media with effusion in children, but for a subgroup of children who had a cleft palate. So that work has been done. It's been well done. I was involved in it. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it was well done, and it did involve parents, and it did involve children as well, giving their views. Now, the reason that that core outcome set was developed was because the HTA program was wanting to actually commission a trial of treatment for OME in children with cleft. And the reason that they'd focused on cleft was because the anatomical issues associated with the cleft palate does make children more prone to otitis media with effusion. So it was a kind of high prevalence problem or issue for children with cleft palate. So we were looking at applying for that commission, and we wanted to know, well, what should the outcomes be? So we thought, let's develop a core outcome set specifically that we would use in that kind of trial. And these are the outcomes that came out. And actually, if you were wanting to look at grommets versus hearing aids in children with otitis media, not with a cleft palate, but generally, if you were to look at that list, you wouldn't really find anything there that was specific about having cleft palate. So the point is, you can see that there, and you can consider, well, actually, you know, why would, if we were to go and develop a core outcome set for children generally, would we really expect much to be different? So it's that thinking about what already exists and whether you have to do something completely new, or whether you can do something that says this looks generalizable, this looks good enough. You know, it's a kind of one of those things, is it an adopt or adapt type strategy, or actually do you need to do something completely new? The second part of deciding whether you can use an existing core outcome set, as I've said, is to have a look at whether you think it's being developed to a sufficiently high quality standard. And you know, as I said, quality is really hard to define in core outcome sets. The COSTAD standards, they're not really quality standards. They're standards about developing a core outcome set, but it's not a bad thing to look at if you're trying to look at a core outcome sets. You know, have they involved relevant stakeholders? Have they been transparent about the consensus methods they used? Have they given the definitions of consensus a priori? Did they do all of that? And so there's, you know, the potential for bias in the results is less. So, okay. What we've also done is try to look at, and we know there are people who have difficulty in applying even an existing core outcome set to their trial. And we've looked, and in Karen's interview, she asked people about what those barriers to using an existing core outcome set was for their trial application. And trialists said things like, it's a real issue in core outcome sets that you end up with a list that is so long that you struggle with burden. Participants certainly don't like it if they're filling in a 50-item questionnaire and feel the first 20 items are repetitive. And there's the meaning for the patient as well. If they're answering questions they don't feel have any meaning, they're less incentivized to complete it. So those sort of points illustrate some things that we've already said about core outcome sets. The patient voice in determining what's core is really important. We want to know what outcomes will have meaning for patients. When it comes to the how stage, although I didn't go into it, there is an assessment of whether how you measure something is unduly burdensome for patients, whether it's feasible, whether patients are happy with it. So that, you know, that sort of the second bullet should be addressed when you're really looking at the how. In terms of the first one, about, oh, you're going to end up with a really long list. Okay, so the assumption here is that a trialist has a list, and then the core outcomes are just going to be added on, as if they're not going to be in the list that the trialist was thinking about to start with. And that may be the case, but I mean, one of the things that I have thrown up here, and we can have a discussion about it. So is firstly, well, what if a core outcome set contains too many outcomes? So this is the thing that has been said. Oh, it just contains too many outcomes. So the question is, what is too many? If we were in a room, we'd all be having a discussion, but it's quite difficult to do this online. So the point is, you can have a core outcome set with 5 outcomes, that if you look at how long it takes to measure all of those things, whether there's a lab test, a scan, and a 50-item questionnaire, it could take 3 hours, could take longer. You can have a list of outcomes that might have 10 things in it, and it takes an hour. So it's not about the number of outcomes, it's about the burden of measurement that needs to be looked at for a core outcome set. And that's generally true when you're thinking about outcomes, of course, in research studies anyway. I've already said that core outcome sets vary in how they've been developed. The development process is evolving. Up till about 2012, 2013, people were just generally doing this occasionally through a professional society. Now there's much more interaction between core outcome set developers, and they're learning from each other about how to improve the way core outcome sets are developed, to the point that now there is a recognition that some core outcome sets really do end up with too many outcomes in that you really think that is too many to be a core outcome set. And some core outcome sets are adding in, after the Delphi process, they are adding in a ranking round. So the Delphi process tells you generally what people are saying, but if you've got 15 outcomes coming out, that's probably too many. You need to look at the burden of measurement, but it probably is too many, and people then take participants through a ranking round trying to get at something that looks more feasible. So as I said, the development process is evolving. Now, the other question that we get asked a lot is, well, my trial's about this, and this is my primary outcome. Well, that's not in the core outcome set, so maybe the core outcome set isn't relevant. So by definition, the primary outcome for a particular trial does not need to be in the core outcome set. That's not the definition of a core outcome set. However, when we've looked, the primary outcome for most trials do tend to be in a core outcome set, but it doesn't have to be by definition. So it's not saying you look at a core outcome set and then you need to power your trial for an outcome in there. That is sometimes the criticism that, well, mortality is in that core outcome set. We can't possibly power the study for mortality. That's not what a core outcome set is. It isn't saying that you have to power a study for all of the outcomes in a core outcome set. Core outcome set is a minimum that will allow you to compare and contrast. If mortality is in a core outcome set, then mortality is an issue in that health condition, and therefore mortality, when it happens, should be measured anyway. I think it's just generally good practice. So I've just kind of said what you're now seeing on the screen, that we do fully expect trialists to add additional outcomes. We haven't yet seen a really good example of where a trialist says, well, look, here was my plan. I was going to measure these 15 outcomes, and now you've come along and told me there's an extra 7 and they're not in my list of 15. I mean, if that was the case, I'd really wonder how the trialists had worked out what the 15 were, because I don't know who they've asked. If a core outcome set's been well developed, they've asked the community of health professionals caring for people with that condition. They've also asked patients with that condition. So, I find that argument that we're just making a list so much longer. If there isn't overlap to start with, I would question where the trialist list comes from. So, in summary, I'm sure you're already aware of problems with outcomes in trials. This is also equally true about routine care. I haven't said very much, but one of the areas of interest right now for trialists is whether or not we can make trials less burdensome for patients, less burdensome for healthcare professionals. Can we run trials through routine care? So can we collect outcome data that is being collected routinely anyway? I mean, people have done that using HES data for many years for health economic analyses, but can we do that for the clinical effectiveness studies? Can we get the relevant information from routinely collected healthcare? We have a PhD student looking at how often core outcomes are measured in routinely collected data. And indeed, we have a study where the core in pediatric asthma at the moment, it's starting in a couple of weeks, where the core outcomes set that I showed you before, you can get exacerbation data and mortality data from routine health records, but you can't get structured PRO data on symptoms. And so we've kind of had to do a kind of hybrid. So it's a study running through CPRD. Patients are recruited through CPR, they're identified through CPRD, they're invited, they're recruited. Their sort of clinical information is collected routinely, and they have an electronic PRO data collection system that where they give us data on their symptoms. So, you know, it's a challenge to know whereabouts we are in terms of, you know, how often core outcome sets are collected routinely. It is that PRO piece that tends to be where there's an issue. Many different organisations are really key here, and you as RDS advisors are really key. Karen's interviews with trialists did show that, you know, not everyone is familiar with core outcome sets. Not everyone has read the NIHR guidance to applicants. So they don't know that they should be considering core outcome sets. So your role in raising awareness is absolutely key. And obviously you give advice on design of studies. And, you know, one of the bits of advice could be, have you looked for a core outcome set? Is it relevant? Is it good enough? Should you be using it? And if you're not, please explain why not in your application, because actually that's what the NIHR panels really ought to be looking at. We have put in place an alert system from our database so that you don't have, if you work in a particular area, or if one of your clients works in a particular area, and they want to be notified when a core outcome set is either registered in their area or published in their area, you can register they can register for an alert. So they don't have to keep checking every month, oh, is there anything new in there? Okay, so we have this facility that's available. Okay, I have come to the end of my slides.